The desert wind sweeps across the Arizona plains, carrying the dry sting of dust and the whisper of echoes long gone. In the streets of Tombstone, boots once clattered on wooden sidewalks, spurs rang out against saloon doors, and the air itself trembled with the unspoken promise of violence. It was here that Wyatt Berry Stapp Earp carved his name into the fabric of Western legend. To some, he was the shield of order in a land gripped by chaos. To others, he was no better than the very men he hunted, a renegade whose six-gun dispensed not law, but vengeance. The Wild West of the late 19th century was more than just a backdrop for dusty gunfights and whiskey-soaked tales. It was a crucible where America's restless spirit collided with greed, ambition, and blood. Towns like Tombstone did not emerge out of thin air. They were born of fever dreams, the glitter of silver, the hunger for land, the rush of cattle drives that brought cowhands and gamblers, ranchers and rustlers, miners and lawmen into one boiling cauldron. Violence was never far away. A single insult, a drunken shove, or the suspicion of cheating at cards could mean a man would not see the morning light. It was into this raw and volatile world that Wyatt Earp stepped, a man shaped by family duty, frontier survival, and a temperament that was equal parts calm, restraint, and explosive fury. He was born in Illinois in 1848, the fourth of 8 children to Nicholas Earp, a restless patriarch with a stern sense of discipline. Nicholas himself was a man of many hats, a farmer, tavern keeper, and sometimes a lawman who carried his family westward in pursuit of better fortunes. The Earp household knew both the hardship of frontier life and the principles of order. Young Wyatt grew up balancing between two forces, the demand for justice and the ever-present lure of frontier violence. The Civil War raged through Wyatt's adolescence. Too young at first to enlist, he nonetheless absorbed the atmosphere of conflict. Stories of brother fighting against brother, law breaking down in border states, and entire towns torn apart by divided loyalties were not distant headlines. They were part of his boyhood landscape. Though Wyatt never became a soldier, the spirit of that brutal era, with its stark choices of survival and allegiance, would leave its mark on him. As the frontier opened, Wyatt's path was anything but steady. He was not born into legend. He stumbled toward it, sometimes wearing the badge of a deputy, other times drifting as a gambler or buffalo hunter. He tasted failure as well as fleeting triumph. What bound his life together was the environment of the frontier itself, a world where official courts were weak, where sheriffs often had more loyalty to their friends than to the law, and where the measure of justice was frequently the length of a barrel. And so the question that shadows Wyatt's life begins to form. Did he rise as a defender of order in lawless lands? Or did he thrive precisely because law was weak enough for men like him to bend it? Was his badge a symbol of civic duty or a license to impose his will? As we journey into Wyatt Earp's story, we will walk through dusty cow towns and crowded mining camps, hear the echoes of 6 guns in Tombstone streets, and ride alongside him on the grim trail of revenge. But before the gunfight at the OK Corral, before the vendetta ride that etched his darker reputation, there was the boy from Illinois, the son of a restless father, who set out to make a life on the American frontier. And it is there, in the endless prairie dust of his youth, that the legend begins. The prairie was a hard schoolmaster, and Wyatt Earp's early manhood carried the marks of both discipline and rebellion. After the Civil War, his family drifted westward, settling in the rough edges of Missouri before moving toward Kansas. The young Wyatt was not yet the man of myth. He tried his hand at farming, hauling freight, and even working as a teamster. But it was restlessness that defined him, an itch to move, to test his luck in towns where opportunity was thick as gunsmoke. His father, Nicholas Earp, never let his sons forget the value of order. Nicholas had once served as a constable, and he taught that authority meant little without the will to enforce it. Wyatt absorbed this lesson well. He was not a loud or boastful youth, but those who met him described him as having an icy calm, a man who could stare another down without a word. That steel in his eyes would become his most dangerous weapon, as deadly in its way as his Colt revolver. By the early 1870s, Wyatt's life had already brushed the line between law and outlaw. He faced charges of horse theft in Illinois, an accusation that forced him to flee for a time. Though he was never convicted, The episode stained his reputation. It is a reminder that Wyatt was not born wearing the halo of a lawman. Like many frontier men, his choices bent with the wind of circumstance. He hunted buffalo for a living, trailed cattle across the open plains, and lived among men whose days were ruled by chance and violence. But it was in the booming cow towns of Kansas, Wichita, and later Dodge City, that Wyatt's identity as a lawman took shape. These were not towns for the faint of heart. At the end of a cattle drive, thousands of longhorns poured into stockyards, followed by dusty cowhands thirsty for whiskey, cards, and women. Saloons spilled over with noise, the clash of poker chips, the shuffle of boots, the music of out-of-tune pianos competing with drunken shouts. With so much money and alcohol on the line, violence was not just possible, it was expected. Here Wyatt Earp wore the badge of deputy marshal. He was not the fastest gun in Dodge. That honor may have belonged to men like Bat Masterson, but Wyatt possessed something perhaps more dangerous: composure. He was known to wade into saloon brawls barehanded, dragging out knife-wielding cowboys by the scruff of the neck. Only when pressed to the edge would his revolver clear leather. Witnesses recalled that Wyatt was a man who could be cool when others lost their heads. A Wichita newspaper once wrote, "Wyatt Earp is quiet until aroused. Then beware the flash of steel and the roar of his revolver." That duality defined him, a man who rarely sought trouble, but answered it with devastating force when it came knocking. Yet even in Dodge City, the line between upholding the law and enforcing personal authority blurred. The cowhands saw him as part of the town's machinery to protect business and profit, not just law. Saloons and gambling dens paid dearly to keep order on their terms, and marshals like Earp benefited from the arrangement. Was he a servant of justice, or a paid strongman in a system of frontier capitalism? The answer, even then, depended on whom you asked. Culturally, Dodge City was a crossroads of America's frontier experiment. Irish and German immigrants filled its saloons. Mexican vaqueros brought their traditions of horsemanship. Freedmen and black cowboys rode the trails alongside white drovers. Wyatt's world was one of constant collision, languages, tempers, and ambitions mixing like whiskey and gunpowder. In that volatile setting, a man with the nerve to stand steady could rise quickly in reputation. Wyatt Earp did just that, but the badge was never a permanent fixture in his life. Just as quickly as he wore it, he would leave it behind, drifting toward gambling tables or chasing business ventures. This inconsistency fueled suspicion. To some, he was a loyal lawman who risked his life to keep peace in rowdy towns. To others, he was an opportunist, using the badge only when it served his fortune. Still, Dodge City hardened him. It gave him allies like Bat Masterson and cemented his bond with Doc Holliday, a gambler and gunman whose loyalty would later prove both boon and curse. More importantly, it sharpened the question that would follow Wyatt into history. When law itself was fragile, could a man be trusted to enforce it without letting vengeance guide his hand? By the late 1870s, Wyatt Earp was restless once more. The silver strikes of Arizona gleamed with promise, and rumors of fortune in a place called Tombstone beckoned. Dodge had given him scars, enemies, and a reputation. Tombstone would give him immortality. By 1879, Wyatt Earp and his brothers turned their gaze southward to a place whispered about in saloons and gambling halls, a silver boom town rising from the desert dust of southeastern Arizona. Tombstone. The name alone carried a foreboding weight, as if destiny itself had christened it with a warning. Yet for thousands of fortune seekers, it was a beacon of promise, glittering with opportunity. Tombstone was no ordinary frontier town. It was the beating heart of a silver strike that drew prospectors from across the nation and beyond. Within just a few years, the town swelled to nearly 7,000 residents, rivaling San Francisco in its ambitions. Its streets were alive with diversity: Irish miners, Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, European immigrants, former soldiers, gunslingers, and businessmen, all colliding in a swirl of languages and tempers. Where money gathered, sin was never far behind. Tombstone boasted more than 100 saloons, gambling dens that never slept, and dance halls where whiskey flowed like water. The clink of poker chips and the shuffle of cards formed the town's true soundtrack. For Wyatt, Tombstone promised not just excitement, but a chance at stability. He had tired of drifting, and dreamed of business ventures that might secure a more respectable life. Alongside his brothers Virgil and Morgan and his common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock, Wyatt settled into the town with cautious optimism. Virgil soon took a post as Deputy U.S. Marshal, lending the Earps a certain authority in the lawless swirl of the mining camp. Wyatt, too, dabbled in law enforcement, but his real interest lay in real estate, gambling, and saloon partnerships. Tombstone was a place where men could reinvent themselves, and Wyatt intended to rise above the dusty trail life. But prosperity was not evenly shared. The booming silver mines made some men rich while others clawed at the edges. Cattle rustling became a lucrative shadow economy, feeding on stolen herds driven north from Mexico. Stagecoaches laden with silver bullion were tempting targets, and highwaymen grew bold in the desert passes. At the center of this outlaw trade stood a loose confederation of ranchers and cowboys, led by the Clanton and McClory families. To townsfolk who despised the Earps, these cowboys were simply ranchers protecting their way of life. To others, they were ruthless brigands who thrived on theft and intimidation. The Earps, with their law connections, stood directly opposed to the cowboys. The tension between the two factions was more than personal rivalry. It was a clash of two visions for the West. One sought order, law, and prosperity under the rules of business and government. The other rejected control, living by the old code of open-range freedom, even if it meant bending the law at every turn. Enter John Henry "Doc" Holliday, a gaunt, sharp-eyed gambler with a deadly reputation. Wyatt's friendship with Doc had been sealed years before in Dodge City, where loyalty was forged in smoky saloons and bloody alleys. Doc was consumptive, coughing up blood into handkerchiefs, but his illness only sharpened his reckless edge. With a shotgun or a six-gun, Holliday was as dangerous as any man alive, and his presence at Wyatt's side would soon tip the balance of fear in Tombstone. The political climate of Tombstone added fuel to the fire. Local law enforcement was riddled with corruption. Sheriff Johnny Bayan, a man with charm but questionable loyalties, often leaned toward the cowboys, whose support bolstered his position. The Earps, in turn, cultivated their own alliances with businessmen who sought stability for their mining investments. Every arrest, every barroom quarrel, became a spark in a tinderbox already dry with tension. In this cauldron, Wyatt's ambition began to waver between law and business, peacekeeping and personal gain. He took part in gambling partnerships, invested in mining claims, and played politics with a careful hand. Yet he never fully shed the aura of lawman. When trouble brewed, Wyatt was still called upon to enforce order, his cold steel demeanor making him a natural choice to confront lawbreakers. As 1881 wore on, the feud between the Earps and the cowboys turned personal. Ike Clanton nursed a bitter hatred for Wyatt and his brothers, fuming at their authority and mocking their claim to lawfulness. Accusations flew on both sides. Stagecoach robberies pinned on the cowboys, corruption charges whispered about the Earps. In the smoky corners of saloons, men took sides, and Tombstone began to divide like a town awaiting civil war. By autumn, the conflict could no longer be contained. The cowboys swaggered through town armed to the teeth, daring the Earps to challenge them. The Earps, with Virgil as marshal, declared that gun ordinances would be enforced. On October 26, 1881, the simmering feud boiled over into destiny. The stage was set for a 30-second storm of bullets that would echo through history. October 26, 1881, Tombstone stirred beneath a cloudless sky, the desert sun burning down on its dusty streets. By mid-morning, rumors drifted through saloons and shops. The cowboys were in town, armed and defiant. Ike Clanton, still drunk from the night before, had been heard threatening the Earps, swearing he'd spill their blood before the day was through. Tension hung thick in the air, as though every man and woman knew that something irreversible was about to unfold. Virgil Earp, acting as city marshal, had already disarmed Ike once that morning. But by afternoon, the cowboys had regrouped. Frank and Tom McClory, Billy Clanton, and others were gathered in a vacant lot near the OK Corral, their pistols and shotguns at hand. To Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday, this was no longer a question of law. It was a challenge hurled at their very authority. The Earps walked together down Fremont Street, the boards rattling under their boots. Wyatt later recalled that his heart was steady, but witnesses said townsfolk ducked behind doors and shutters as the four men passed. It was as if Tombstone itself was holding its breath. The lot where the gunfight erupted was no grand battlefield. It was a cramped space, wedged between a photography studio and a boarding house. Horses stamped their hooves nervously at hitching posts as men squared off, only a few yards apart. Sheriff Johnny Bayan tried to intervene, stepping in to insist the cowboys had already surrendered their arms. But the Earps pressed on, suspicion written in every line of their faces. Then the silence shattered. In 30 seconds of chaos, gunfire roared through the lot. Witnesses never agreed on who fired first. Some swore it was Billy Clanton. Others pointed to Doc Holliday's shotgun. The only certainty was the thunder of shots, the acrid stench of black powder, and men stumbling, bleeding into the dirt. Tom McLaury fell first, buckshot tearing into his side. Frank McLaury, mortally wounded, fired back as he staggered into the street. Billy Clanton clutched at his revolver even as his body gave way, gasping for breath, refusing to surrender until death forced his hand. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys lay dead. Virgil and Morgan were wounded, Doc's lip was grazed by a bullet, and Wyatt Earp, the man at the center of the storm, stood untouched. The town reeled. Some cheered the Earps, calling them heroes who had finally broken the lawless grip of the cowboys. Others cried murder, claiming the Earps had executed men who wanted only to lay down their arms. Newspapers across the territory split in their verdicts. The Tombstone epitaph praised Wyatt as a man of iron courage. The Nugget, friendlier to the cowboys, condemned the shootout as a massacre. Wyatt himself said little in public. He carried himself with the same cold composure, refusing to let grief or triumph show. But behind that stillness was a storm brewing. For the gunfight at the OK Corral was not an ending. It was the opening shot in a far darker chapter. Trials followed, with Judge Spicer eventually ruling that the Earps had acted within their duty as officers of the law. Legally, they were absolved. But law on the frontier was never settled by paper alone. In the saloons, whispers grew. Cowboys vowed revenge, and their friends waited for the chance to strike back. The OK Corral left Tombstone divided, its people caught between admiration for men who had enforced order and suspicion that those same men had abused their power. The line between lawman and killer had never been thinner, and Wyatt's shadow loomed taller than ever. In the weeks that followed, the feud would turn personal, and blood would run deeper. For the cowboys had not yet finished with the Earps, and Wyatt Earp, lawman though he was, would soon abandon the badge for something far more primal: vengeance. The gunfight at the OK Corral might have ended in 30 seconds, but its echoes rang through Tombstone for months, shaking the town to its foundations. For Wyatt Earp and his brothers, it was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of a private war. The cowboys, bloodied and humiliated, thirsted for revenge, and they would not wait long to strike back. On the night of December 28, 1881, Marshal Virgil Earp was walking home along Allen Street when assassins lurked in the shadows. Gunfire exploded, cutting him down in a hail of buckshot. Virgil survived, but his left arm was shattered, leaving him crippled for life. The attack was cowardly, done under cover of darkness, but it revealed the cowboys' intent. They would not rest until the Earps were destroyed. Wyatt's rage smoldered beneath his icy exterior. If Virgil's maiming stung, the next blow would cut deeper. On the evening of March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was shot in the back while playing billiards, the bullet tearing through his spine. He died within minutes, his final moments witnessed by Wyatt himself. The family was shattered. The law offered no solace. Suspects were questioned but never held. Evidence evaporated into the desert air. To Wyatt, the message was clear. The courts and the badge were powerless. Only steel and lead could balance the scales. And so began the vendetta ride. Wyatt gathered a posse of hardened men, each bound by loyalty and thirst for justice. Among them were Doc Holliday, coughing blood into his kerchief, but as dangerous as ever; Sherman McMaster, a former cowboy turned ally; Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, and Texas Jack Vermillion. These were not officers of the law anymore. They were hunters, and their quarry was every cowboy tied to the attacks on the Earp family. What followed was less a campaign of justice than a grim procession of retribution. On March 20th, Florentino Indian Charlie Cruz was tracked down and executed, accused of serving as a lookout in Morgan's murder. Days later, in a canyon along the San Pedro River, Wyatt and his men ambushed Curly Bill Brocious, one of the cowboys' most feared leaders. In a storm of gunfire, Curly Bill fell dead, his body riddled with bullets. Wyatt himself was said to have delivered the fatal shot with a Winchester rifle, cutting down the man who had tormented Arizona's frontier for years. But Wyatt's fury did not stop there. Frank Stillwell, suspected in Morgan's assassination, was cornered near a train station and left lifeless in the dust. Other cowboys vanished into the desert, their names whispered in connection to Wyatt's relentless ride. Legends grew quickly, tales of Wyatt riding with fire in his eyes, a man transformed from lawman into something darker, something elemental. Vengeance made flesh. Even those who admired Wyatt admitted he had crossed into new territory. He no longer sought arrest warrants or trials. He rode with the purpose of extermination. The vendetta ride blurred the lines between martial and outlaw, justice and murder. Tombstone itself trembled under the weight of this private war, and citizens debated fiercely. Had Wyatt become the very thing he swore to oppose? To his supporters, the answer was clear. Wyatt was a man pushed beyond human endurance, a brother avenging his kin when the law failed. To his enemies, he was a renegade, no better than the rustlers and assassins he pursued. Some even claimed he relished the bloodshed, his vengeance spilling beyond what justice demanded. By April 1882, the ride was over. The cowboys were broken, their powers scattered across the desert. But Wyatt Earp was a wanted man, accused of murder by those who saw no law in his vengeance. He left Arizona a fugitive, his legend trailing behind him like the dust of his horses. The vendetta ride marked the true turning point in Wyatt's life. No longer could he be seen simply as a lawman. He had stepped into a shadowed realm where justice and vengeance were indistinguishable, where survival demanded blood. And though he would live another 47 years, it was in those weeks of fire and steel that Wyatt Earp became both immortalized and damned in the eyes of history. When the desert dust of Arizona finally settled, Wyatt Earp was already gone, riding westward into exile. The vendetta ride had broken the cowboys' power, but it had also broken Wyatt's ties to the law. He left Tombstone not as a marshal, but as a fugitive, his name praised by some and cursed by others. Yet in truth, Tombstone was only one chapter of a life that stretched far beyond the narrow streets of that silver town. Wyatt drifted across the American West, searching for new beginnings. He worked as a gambler in Colorado, chased fortunes in Alaska's gold rush, and invested in real estate in booming California towns. Wherever he went, his reputation preceded him. In saloons from San Francisco to Nome, the whispers were the same. That's Wyatt Earp, the man from Tombstone. Some would shake his hand in admiration, others would avoid his gaze, unsure if the stories of vengeance were myth or fact. But the man himself was never eager to explain. Wyatt rarely spoke about Tombstone or the OK Corral, leaving others to craft the legend in his place. To friends he was calm, reserved, almost ordinary in his manner. To enemies he remained a ghost of the frontier, a figure who embodied the thin line between law and bloodshed. In time, his story began to pass into the hands of writers and dreamers. Dime novels of the late 19th century exaggerated his deeds, painting him as a fearless knight of the frontier. Later, Hollywood would seize on his image, transforming Wyatt Earp into the archetype of the American lawman. Square-jawed, righteous, unyielding. Films like My Darling Clementine and Gunfight at the OK Corral mythologized the events in Tombstone, polishing away the ambiguity until only heroism remained. Yet history, as it often does, tells a more complicated tale. The truth is that Wyatt Earp lived long enough to witness his own myth take shape. He died in Los Angeles in 1929, at the age of 80, a relic of a world that no longer existed. Silent film stars like John Wayne and Tom Mix attended his funeral, carrying the torch of the frontier into Hollywood's golden age. Wyatt, who had once ridden through deserts and gambling halls, now lived on in celluloid shadows, a legend larger than the man himself. And still the question endures. Was Wyatt Earp a steadfast defender of order, standing firm when chaos threatened to engulf the frontier? Or was he a vengeful renegade, wielding the badge as a shield while settling his own blood feuds? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. He was a man forged by the frontier, where the law was fragile, survival demanded ruthlessness, and justice was often written in gunsmoke. As the sun sets over the Arizona desert, the echoes of Tombstone remain. Tourists walk the same streets, gazing at reenactments of the OK Corral, their eyes fixed on a past both real and imagined. In those dusty echoes, Wyatt Earp's ghost still lingers. Lawman to some, outlaw to others, forever caught in the shadows of the Wild West. And so, we leave the question with you. When you hear the name Wyatt Earp, do you picture the steady badge of a lawman or the burning eyes of a renegade?